Around 8 p.m. on November 3, 2013, 45-year-old Will Walker taped up a cardboard box in the master bedroom of his home in Cleveland, Ohio. He labeled it with a Sharpie and then stacked it with a bunch of other moving boxes in the corner that he had also made up. Will was in the middle of moving his family out of their current place in the city to a bigger house in the suburbs. And even though it did sort of seem like an upgrade, he had mixed feelings about it, in part because he'd invested a lot in this community in the city. He'd raised kids here with his first wife, and he also worked here as a lieutenant firefighter. But Will knew it was time for a big life change, because his beloved new wife, Yuloma Curry Walker, had recently been diagnosed with cancer. And realistically, she actually didn't have very long left to live, and so Will wanted her to spend the time that she had left in a neighborhood that was more comfortable and more quiet than this one. As Will began to pack one of those moving boxes he had made, he felt his stomach growl. He was hungry. So before getting into really heavy packing, he stopped and he headed down the hallway to the living room, where he found his wife laying on the couch wrapped in a blanket. And she was clearly on the phone with her 17-year-old daughter, Jackie. So Will and Yuloma both had previously been married, and they both had kids from their previous marriages. But most of them were adults, and they had moved out and they were living their own lives. Except for Jackie, the girl that was on the phone with Yuloma right now. She actually still lived with Yuloma and Will. But this evening, she was across town at her boyfriend's place, but for the time being, she was just chatting with her mom on the phone. As Will approached the couch, Yuloma looked up at him and she waved and she smiled. And as she continued chatting with Jackie on the phone, she began coughing, just a small dry cough, but immediately Will was on edge because anytime he heard his wife coughing or just acting like she was sick, he worried that this was the start of the end. Is this her dying? He was just so worried about her. But luckily the coughing passed and she just kept on chatting away with Jackie. And so Will, he walked up to her and he sort of gently interrupted her and just said, "Hey, you want me to run out and grab us both some dinner? I'm pretty hungry." Yuloma, she nodded and she smiled and she covered up the phone and said, "Yeah, I'd love to get some McDonald's." And then she just went back to her call with Jackie. And then Will, he bent down and he kissed her on the top of the head, he grabbed his keys, and he headed out the door. McDonald's sounded great. A half an hour later, at 8:30 p.m., Will pulled back into his driveway and parked in front of the garage, he cut the engine, and then he grabbed the McDonald's bag off the passenger seat. As he stepped out of the car, though, he paused and intentionally looked back out toward the street, just to make sure the coast was clear. So Will had lived on this block for decades, and it had always been sort of a rough neighborhood. But lately, it just seemed to be getting a whole lot worse. Less than a month ago, Will had actually gotten into this really heated argument with a guy right here in his driveway. And it had been so heated that Will had actually brandished a gun to get the guy to leave. Will was still very much on edge about that, sort of worried this man would come back to, exact his revenge or something. And in some ways, this was another reason why he felt like maybe it really was time to move out of here and get to the suburbs. But for now, looking out to the road and the sort of surrounding areas, he didn't see anything or anyone that concerned him. So he closed his car door and with his McDonald's bag in hand, he crossed the driveway towards the back door of the house. However, when he slipped his key into the lock on the door, he heard footsteps coming up behind him. And as Will turned, there was a deafening bang. Inside the house at the same time, Yuloma heard the sound of what sounded like 4 gunshots echoing from outside. Instinctively, she leapt off the couch and ran over to the window, still clutching her blanket tight around her. And when she looked outside, she saw her husband's car in the driveway, but she didn't see her husband, or anyone for that matter. Nobody was outside. Then she heard the sound of someone moaning in pain, and it was like instinctively she immediately knew it had to be Will. And so she ran to the back door, she's frantic, she opens it up, and there he was. 30 minutes later, around 9 p.m., Detective Tom Lynch of the Cleveland Police Department stood outside of Will and Yuloma's back door, staring down at a pool of blood on the ground. Behind him, an officer was cordoning off what was now a crime scene, while detectives and forensic specialists searched the area for evidence. Lynch had reached the scene only about 10 minutes ago, but already he had pieced together some basic facts. Will Walker, the victim, was a 45-year-old lieutenant firefighter, and he had been shot 4 times in his own driveway. His wife, Yuloma, had found him bleeding out by the back door and immediately called 911, and Will had been rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. He was obviously very badly hurt, but apparently he was still alive. Now, Lynch knew that because Will Walker, the victim, was a respected member of the community, he was a, longtime firefighter, that very likely there would be increased pressure on Lynch and his team to figure out who did this. But in a neighborhood as rough as this one, Lynch knew that was not going to be an easy task. Now, as Lynch studied the outside of the crime scene, his gaze traveled from the pool of blood where Will had been found to the bag of fast food lying a few feet away, and then up to the keys that were still dangling from the lock on the door. It looked like Will had been ambushed while walking from his car to the house. It was a very short distance, which meant the shooter would have only had maybe a few seconds to make their move. Lynch heard someone call his name from behind him, and he turned around to see another detective just a few feet away, pointing to something in the grass. And so Lynch walked over and then crouched down and saw that what they were pointing to was a 9mm shell casing. Then the detective pointed out another shell casing, and then another, and another. And they all led in a straight line toward the back corner of the garage. Not inside the garage, but like the back exterior of the garage. And so Lynch, he followed the line of shell casings towards that corner, and he found there was this small gap between the back of the garage and the back fence. In this area, there were no lights. It was very well shielded from the street. Like if you were back here, nobody could see you, really. And so this was like a perfect hiding spot for the shooter. As Lynch took in all this new information, he tried to visualize what might have happened here. He pictured the shooter waiting right here behind the garage, not coming from the street, but over here waiting, and then Will comes into the driveway, he gets out of his car, he makes his way towards the door, at which point the shooter comes out and starts shooting. It was an ambush, which suggested that, especially based on the location of these shell casings, like this was truly somebody waiting for Will. This was not like a botched robbery, this was not random. This was someone who likely knew Will was going to be back soon, and they waited for him, and then they shot him. And so at this point, Lynch felt pretty confident that this was a premeditated murder, or at least attempted murder, because at that point, it was believed that Will was still alive at the hospital. And if he was still alive, Lynch hoped he'd be able to identify the shooter. 2 hours later, around 11:30 p.m., Lynch followed a nurse down a hospital corridor. Will Walker was still in surgery, so in the meantime, Lynch was going to speak with Will's wife, Yuloma. The nurse led Lynch into a private waiting room for family members. And right away, Lynch saw Yuloma sitting alone in one of the chairs. She was wearing a big coat and a scarf, but she kept rubbing her hands together and shivering like she was cold. Lynch nodded to the nurse to let her know that he could take it from here, and so she left to give them some privacy. Then Lynch went over to introduce himself to Yuloma. He sat down and he took out his notepad, and then he gently explained that he was leading the investigation into Will's shooting, and he needed to know everything she could remember about that night. Yuloma, who was still clearly very cold and shivering, she nodded, and in a weak voice, she explained that just before the gunshots, she'd been home alone. Will had been out getting them dinner, and her daughter Jackie was over at her boyfriend's place. Then at 8:30 p.m., she said she heard those 4 loud bangs. She'd run outside and found her husband bleeding out in the driveway, and so she called 911. Lynch nodded as he jotted down everything she was saying. But nothing she was saying was particularly revelatory. I mean, her story matched up with what he had seen at the crime scene and what first responders had told him about what they saw. So now Lynch flipped his notepad over, and he asked the question that in some ways mattered the most in terms of what Yuloma could offer him. Did her husband have any enemies? However, before Yuloma could answer, there was a knock at the door. And a second later, a pair of doctors came inside. And from their expressions, Lynch knew it was not good news. Instinctively, Lynch stood up and stepped out of the way as one of these doctors came over to Yuloma, and they took her hand and told her that her husband, Will Walker, was dead. Around 9 a.m. the next morning, November 4th, Detective Tom Lynch stood in the rec room of a Cleveland fire station speaking to 3 firefighters who were co-workers of Will Walker, who had been shot to death the night before. Lynch's conversation with Will's wife, Yuloma, the night before in the hospital had understandably been cut short when she received the news of her husband's death. So now Lynch was trying to get information from anyone else who was close to Will before he ultimately went back and asked Yoloma that question about, did her husband have any enemies? And so for now, he was here at the fire station to find out if maybe any of Will's coworkers knew about any conflicts Will had with anybody. But so far, from speaking with the guys who worked with Will, it sounded like he was the most popular guy at the station. Everybody liked him. These firefighters kept telling Lynch what a hero Will was, and how Lynch needed to solve this case quickly because Will and his family, they deserve justice. The community deserved justice. So Lynch was naturally feeling a lot of pressure to deliver here. But he was actually kind of optimistic for two reasons. First, because DNA had been recovered from the shell casing from Will's driveway. Now, the DNA didn't match anyone in law enforcement databases, but this was still a really strong development because Lynch knew he'd be able to test any suspects against that DNA from the shells. And the second reason he was optimistic is because once he was finished here at the fire station, Lynch actually was heading to an interview with Yoloma. She'd had a little time to process the news, and now, apparently, she was ready to speak to him again. A half hour later, Lynch was sitting across from Yoloma inside of an interview room at the Cleveland police station. She looked absolutely exhausted, and by now, Lynch knew that it was not just from having been up all night, very likely, dealing with the grief of losing her husband, but also because, according to Will's coworkers, Yoloma had cancer. And in fact, it was her terminal cancer diagnosis that had ultimately pushed Will to marry her after 8 years together. Prior to the diagnosis, Will and Yoloma had sort of taken their time in terms of how they would define their relationship, because they'd both been married before, and they didn't want to rush into anything, because obviously their previous marriages didn't go well. But when Yoloma got really sick, and it was clear she didn't have much time left, they decided, enough waiting, let's just get married. And so now, Lynch picked up with Yoloma where they had left off the night before. He asked her again, did Will have any enemies? And after spending the entire morning listening to Will's coworkers talk about what a good man Will was, Lynch expected Yoloma to say no. But instead, Yoloma nodded and said yes, he did. But she also quickly said that it was definitely true that the vast majority of people loved Will, her included. He was a great guy. He was very popular at work, and he was beloved in the neighborhood. And he was very close with his kids and stepkids, and he was even on good terms with his ex-wife Rita. But Yoloma said she could think of at least two men Will definitely had not gotten along with. Yoloma explained that the first man she suspected was actually her own ex-husband, Macklin Hines. Yoloma described Macklin as an ex-convict with an explosive temper. She said Macklin had always been very possessive towards her, even after they had gotten a divorce. And that possessiveness had only intensified after she had recently married Will just 4 months ago. Yoloma said she didn't know if Macklin was jealous enough to have committed murder here, but she knew he was definitely capable of violence. And she said that she had not heard from Macklin in several days. The second person that Yoloma said Will had issues with was actually a man from the neighborhood named Eugene Cray. According to Yoloma, Eugene was friends with their next-door neighbor, and whenever Eugene came by to pick up his friend, the neighbor, he would sit out in his car smoking weed, blasting music, and blocking Yoloma and Will's driveway. And Yoloma said this had really bothered Will. And a few weeks before the murder, he'd finally lost his patience. One afternoon, when Eugene had shown up again with his car, blocking the driveway, blasting his music, smoking his weed, Will had pulled out his handgun and stormed out of the house to confront him. Now, Yoloma said she hadn't seen what happened next, but she heard shouting and then the sound of Eugene speeding away. And when Will came back inside, clearly amped up from this confrontation, he just told Yoloma that he had handled it and Eugene would not be back. And so at this point, Lynch stopped for a second and just thought about what he had been told. In terms of this Eugene story, it sounded like Will had really lost his temper. And if he had maybe embarrassed or threatened Eugene, that was the kind of thing that could turn into a grudge that could lead to murder. And so at this point, to Lynch, Eugene was sounding like a really, really good suspect, especially since his recent argument with Will had actually taken place in the same area where Will was ultimately killed. 3 days later, on November 7th, around 6 p.m., Detective Lynch walked through a big candlelight vigil on Yaloma and Will Street. A massive crowd, hundreds of neighbors, firefighters, and police officers had come out to honor Will. Lynch scanned the crowd, and he eventually found Will's family, and they were clearly speaking with reporters. Will's 2 adult children were standing there beside this woman who Lynch guessed was Will's ex-wife, Rita Walker, and then a few feet away from them was Yaloma, looking very frail as she leaned on her teenage daughter, Jackie. And for Lynch, seeing this vigil and seeing, Will's bereaved family just standing there in the middle of all this just sadness, it was heart-wrenching. And in part because he knew that despite his early optimism, the investigation into Will's killer was really not going particularly well, at least not so far. For the past couple of days, Lynch and his team have been trying to contact Eugene by phone and at his home, but he seemed to have just vanished. And to make matters worse, Lynch's other main suspect, Yaloma's ex-husband, Macklin Hines, hadn't panned out. It turned out there was actually an extremely good reason why nobody had heard from him for days around the time of the shooting. It was because Hines had actually been in jail on the night of Will's murder. Like, he literally couldn't have done this. Now, of course, it was still possible that he could have hired someone to do it, but as for now, it seemed like Macklin was not as good of a suspect as they once thought. And now, as Lynch stood there at this vigil amongst so many mourners, he knew that if his investigation didn't start delivering answers soon, a lot of people were going to be very disappointed. And to get those answers, Lynch knew they needed to find Eugene Cray. More than a month later, Detective Lynch was back inside of the police station's interview room, sitting across from a skinny, scowling man. This was Eugene Cray, and he'd walked into the station earlier that morning, demanding to know why the police were leaving flyers with this photo all over his block. And Lynch had actually been kind of amused that Eugene was acting so indignant, because for more than a month, police had been doing everything they possibly could just to contact this guy. They'd knocked on Eugene's door, they'd left messages, asked Eugene's neighbors for help, but there had not been one single peep out of Eugene that entire time. Almost like he didn't want to be found. But the flyers seemed to have flushed Eugene out, and now Lynch sat across from him, waiting for him to explain why he'd apparently been in hiding since the night of Will's death. But Eugene just folded his arms and said he didn't have anything to do with the shooting. He said he'd been at home in bed that night listening to music with his headphones on. So he said he hadn't even heard the gunshots, and he lived in the same rough area, so he would have, but he didn't, because he was in bed with headphones on. Now, Lynch thought this was a very poor alibi because, Eugene didn't have anybody who could confirm that he had been at home, in bed, headphones on at the time of the murder. It was just his word against everybody else's. And so instead of trying to, dig into the alibi, Lynch just asked Eugene about that confrontation he had had with Will a few weeks before the shooting. And Eugene told him pretty much the same story that Yaloma had. That he had been outside, he'd been sitting in his car, according to him, he was minding his own business, when Will suddenly appeared, storming out of his house, waving a gun in the air, yelling for Eugene to turn down his music. And Eugene said, just from the look on Will's face, he seemed mad enough that he might actually use the gun. So Eugene said he just sped off as fast as he could. Lynch studied Eugene as he was saying this, and there was just something about this guy's demeanor that it seemed unlikely that Eugene would have let their conflict end right there. That, Will came out, he yelled at Eugene, and Eugene drove off, and that was it. Like, the idea that Eugene was just gonna go on with life and not be upset with Will, it just seems sort of far-fetched. And so he really wanted Eugene's DNA. That way he could just test it against the shell-casing DNA and find out the truth. But Lynch knew that Eugene had a history of prior arrests and seemed to know his way around a police interview, so Lynch guessed that if he pressed for a DNA swab right now, Eugene would refuse and very likely lawyer up. But Lynch at the same time felt like he really did need this swab, like he had to ask. So, doing his best to not seem too eager, Lynch leaned back in his chair and, as casually as possible, asked if Eugene would submit a DNA sample, just so they could rule him out as a suspect. And to Lynch's surprise, Eugene just shrugged and said, okay. About 3 months after the murder, in February of 2014, Detective Lynch sat at his desk reading through a thick stack of financial documents. Now, by this point, the Will Walker murder investigation had pretty much stalled out, because Eugene Cray's DNA did not match the DNA on the shell casings found at the scene. Still, Lynch had pressed on and questioned everyone he could think of: Will's neighbors, his coworkers, his kids, his stepkids, and even their romantic partners. Lynch's team had also poured through hours upon hours of security camera footage collected from the homes and businesses that were near Will's house. But even after all that effort, Lynch was nowhere closer to solving this case. So now, with really no other ideas, Lynch was just going through all of Will's financial records that he could get his hands on: bank statements, loan documents, mortgages. And Lynch's eyes were starting to glaze over when a stray form suddenly caught his eye. It was an addendum to a $100,000 life insurance policy for Will. According to this form, to this addendum, in the event that Will died, that money would not go to Yoloma or his kids or his immediate family. It would go to his ex-wife, Rita Walker, who he hadn't been married to for 9 years. The following afternoon, in February of 2014, Detective Tom Lynch led Rita Walker into an interview room at the Cleveland police station. And Rita seemed very confused about why she was being questioned again, 3 months after her ex-husband, Fire Lieutenant Will Walker, had been murdered. So immediately after the killing, Rita, along with Yoloma and all the kids and stepkids, they had all been interviewed pretty much right away. And at the time, Lynch hadn't even considered Rita a suspect. So this time, when Lynch sat down with her, the questions were different, because now there appeared to be a clear motive for Rita to want to harm Will. So he began by asking Rita where she was on the night of the murder. And right away, Rita's expression sort of tightened. She paused and then said that she couldn't really remember all the details, but she said that she had stopped by Will and Yoloma's house around 1 p.m. to pick up her son, who had spent that morning helping Will and Yoloma pack. And this information sort of caught Lynch off guard. I mean, he knew that, Will was shot at night, and Rita is describing being at Will's house in the afternoon, so hours before the shooting. But here she was, admitting that she was there on the day of the murder. She was at the scene of the crime. So Detective Lynch moved on to the real reason he had asked her to come down. And he asked about that life insurance policy that listed her, rather than Yoloma or anybody else in the family, as the beneficiary. And Rita, she sat back for a second and just stared at Lynch. And then she nodded and said, of course she knew about that, because that was how it was meant to be. She explained to Lynch that Will had taken out that policy as a safety net for his kids, and he had named Rita as the beneficiary because he trusted her to divide the money between their kids. And to Lynch, he had to admit this did sort of make sense, but he also had a different theory. He suspected that Will had just never gotten around to updating the form, but with his recent marriage to Yoloma, it was probably on his to-do list. And if Rita had figured that out, it might have pushed her to have Will killed before he could remove her from his own policy. But that was really just a hunch that he kept to himself. And Lynch also knew he really didn't have the evidence to charge Rita with anything here. And after almost half an hour of questioning, Rita was still very confidently sticking to her story. So eventually Lynch told her that she was free to go. Then Lynch, he got up and he walked Rita out to the front of the building. But as he watched Rita get into her car and pull out of the parking lot, his eyes narrowed because he suddenly realized he recognized Rita's car from somewhere. Lynch's mind immediately began to race as he ran back to his office and turned on his computer. And once the computer was on, he pulled up the security footage from Will's neighborhood. And after scrubbing through a dozen files, he found what he was looking for. A security camera had captured footage of Rita's car just a few blocks away from Will's house right before he was killed. This was clearly not that afternoon visit that Rita had already told Lynch about. This was a second visit to Will's neighborhood that she had not mentioned at all. Less than half an hour later, Rita was back inside the interview room, and Lynch was staring her down as she frantically tried to explain herself. Now that Lynch had confronted her with this footage, Rita had totally changed her story, admitting that she had actually gone back to Will's house that night. but she said it was just to pick up some shoes her son had left there and that she'd left long before Will's murder. But what Rita really couldn't explain was, if this was so innocent, why hadn't she mentioned it before? And so now, Lynch just stared at her, letting his silence pressure her to keep on talking. He was hoping Rita would slip up or crack or confess, but as the interview went on, Rita just kept insisting again and again that this was an honest mistake, that second visit meant nothing, she was just getting shoes, and she didn't know why she didn't bring it up. And this was a problem for Lynch and the whole investigation, because even though the facts did look quite bad for Rita, she had a motive, she had been at the crime scene close to the time of the murder, and she'd failed to tell the police about being at the crime scene. But Lynch knew that he still didn't have enough to charge her with anything. And so Lynch sat there hoping that Rita would, offer up something that would allow him to charge her, like a confession or just anything. But she stuck to her story again and again. And eventually, once more, he had to let her walk out. 9 months later, in December of 2014, Detective Lynch was in his office when his phone rang. He answered, and the station receptionist said a man from Will Walker's neighborhood had just come into the precinct, claiming he had vital information about the murder. Apparently, this man was being escorted to an interview room, and Lynch could go question him when he was ready. Lynch said thank you and hung up the phone, but then he just sort of sighed and sat back and rubbed his forehead because he was not optimistic about this new lead. Because 1 month ago, the Cleveland Firefighters Union had announced a $24,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Will's killer. And ever since then, the station had been flooded with false tips. And so Lynch and his team, they'd spent weeks chasing down basically rumors that went nowhere, and it was really frustrating. So even though he figured that, whoever this guy was waiting for him in the interview room was very likely gonna go nowhere, it was gonna be another dead end, he still felt like, you know what, I got nothing else to do. I'll go see, what he knows. So he stood up, he left his office, he made his way down the hall, he walked into the interview room, and sure enough, there's this guy he didn't know who's sitting behind the table. And so Lynch, he sat down as well, and he just said, okay, what do you know about what happened to Will Walker? And this man, instead of saying anything in response to that question, just pulled out his phone, put it on the table, and hit play. And when Lynch realized what he was listening to, his eyes went wide, because the audio on this man's phone had just cracked the case wide open. Based on the evidence that was collected at the crime scene and on witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Will Walker on the night of November 3rd, 2013. At around 8:30 p.m., the killer, who was very nervous, was hiding in the shadows behind Will Walker's garage. They were doing their best to try to calm themselves down, to be ready for what they were about to do, but they knew it was going to be very risky for them. Just then, the killer heard a car pulling into the driveway. And as the engine cut off, the killer leaned out of their hiding spot and saw Will Walker step out of his car with a fast food bag in one hand and his keys in the other. The killer took a deep breath at this point because they knew this was it. And as Will began walking across the driveway toward the back door, the killer drew their gun, rushed out of their hiding spot, and began shooting. And they ran as they shot. And as Will fell to the ground, a flash of red in the air told the killer that they had hit him. So without stopping to check for a pulse, to make sure Will was actually dead, the killer turned and ran to the fence, climbed over it, and jumped down into the alley behind the house where the getaway car was waiting. The killer leapt into the back seat right as the driver began peeling out of the alleyway, and as they're speeding along, the person sitting in the front passenger seat turned around and asked the killer, "Is Will dead?" And when the killer, who was still laying in the back seat, composing themselves, they nodded and said yes, he was, the person in the passenger seat just turned back around, pulled out their phone, typed a text, and then hit send. That text message confirming the shooting went straight to the person who had actually orchestrated this hit on Will Walker. And when the text came through to the architect's phone, that person was actually standing over Will as he bled out. The architect was also the same person who called 911 and who would cradle Will as he lay there dying. because the mastermind of this murder was Will Walker's beloved, cancer-stricken wife, Yaloma Curry Walker. Except Yaloma was not at all what she seemed, starting with the fact that she didn't actually have cancer. From the very beginning, Yaloma's cancer diagnosis had been a big, elaborate lie. Police believe she fabricated the illness just to convince Will to finally marry her, because that way she could, 1, be put on his health insurance policy, and 2, if he were to die, she could collect on his life insurance policy. But Yaloma didn't realize that Will's life insurance policy was still in Rita's name. But despite that oversight, it did not stop Yaloma from putting a tremendous amount of planning into the plot to murder Will. In fact, if you remember that phone call that Yaloma was having with her daughter Jackie, that when Will walked in the living room, there was Yaloma, she's on the phone, and he asked her if she wanted dinner, and she's like, yeah, go to McDonald's. Well, that phone call with Jackie is the one that actually sealed his fate. Because the instant Will left the house to go get their dinner, Yaloma, who's still on the phone with Jackie, told her daughter that, hey, he just left. And Jackie, who knew the plan, she passed that message along to her boyfriend, Chad Paget, who was sitting in a car right down the street from Will's house, waiting for this message. And he was there along with his getaway car driver and the man he had hired to actually carry out the shooting. The shooter was Ryan Doherty, a young man from the neighborhood who had agreed to kill Will for $800 and some marijuana. And the getaway car driver was actually just a friend of Chad's who thought they were there to buy drugs. Yaloma had promised to pay Jackie and Chad for finding people to kill her husband for her, but Chad was very sloppy, and one of the people he offered the job to was later caught on tape talking about it. And that recording is how the investigators came to learn that Chad, Jackie, and Yaloma were all involved. And at first, they really couldn't believe it, because Yaloma's performance as a cancer-stricken, dying widow had been so masterful, no one had looked close enough to see who she really was. Yaloma Curry Walker was arrested on September 8, 2015, and she was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for her role in the murder plot. As for the people she convinced to participate in this plot, they were convicted on a range of charges and spent between 2 years and life in prison. And then as for Rita Walker, Will's ex-wife, she was not involved in the murder in any way, so her story was absolutely true, and she would eventually receive that life insurance payout, just as Will had planned. On the afternoon of June 19, 2001, 44-year-old Debbie Triplett and her husband Billy were stocking shelves in the small country grocery store that they owned in Clay County, Alabama. Billy and Debbie had run the store together for almost 20 years, and they had stocking shelves down to a science. They barely even had to look while they were doing it. So today, like most days, they spent the time talking and joking with each other. For as long as they'd been doing this, Billy and Debbie never got bored working at the store together. In fact, they didn't understand how anyone would get bored working with the person they loved, because the two of them had been pretty much inseparable from the moment they met back in 1982. At the time, Billy, who was 8 years older than Debbie, already owned the grocery store, but he'd been having trouble running it by himself. So, when Debbie came in looking for a job, he'd hired her right away. And it didn't take long for them to discover that they had a lot in common. They were both single parents, they loved living in a small town where they knew their kids would be safe, and they could talk to each other for hours without ever running out of things to say. Billy and Debbie's relationship had quickly gone from boss and employee to boyfriend and girlfriend to husband and wife. And their children from their previous marriages ended up loving each other as much as Debbie and Billy did. So they had all quickly formed this really tight-knit blended family. Now, almost 20 years later, the kids had grown up and moved out, but they all lived close by, so the blended family was still together. In the store, Billy kept stocking the shelves, but Debbie glanced up at the clock hanging over the counter and said that maybe they should call it a day. Billy was supposed to meet up with their son Randy, and if he wanted to do that and still get home in time for the first pitch of the Atlanta Braves baseball game, he needed to head out now. Everyone who knew Billy assumed he must have been born in an Atlanta Braves baseball cap, because he wore one pretty much every day. They also knew he absolutely hated to miss a Braves game. But today, Billy wasn't sure if he should just take off, because he really didn't like the idea of leaving Debbie alone at the store. The couple didn't like to talk about it, But on a night about 3 months earlier, when Billy was closing the store on his own, 3 men wearing ski masks had burst in, duct taped Billy's mouth, shoved him into the walk-in cooler, and then robbed the cash register. By the time Billy had gotten out of the cooler, the men were long gone, but all he could think was, thank God Debbie was not here. Debbie could see the look of concern on her husband's face, and she told him not to worry. Those robbers had not been seen again. Besides, their daughter Michelle was coming by to keep her company for a while, and then she'd close the store because she had dinner plans. Billy thought about it for a second, and then said she was right. So he gave Debbie a kiss and said he would see her at home when she was finished with dinner. Later that afternoon, Debbie's daughter Michelle walked into the store, and the 2 women immediately started talking like they were best friends. Debbie had Michelle and her brother Michael with her first husband, but they had treated Billy as their dad since they were young, just like Billy's son, Randy, saw Debbie as his mother. Still, Debbie shared a bond with Michelle that was special, even among the kids. They saw or talked to each other every single day. Time always flew by when it was just the 2 of them, and today at the store was no different. They talked about everything that was going on in their lives, and when Michelle finally caught a glimpse of the clock, she said she needed to head out. But Michelle hesitated, because like Billy, she wanted to make sure her mom would be okay on her own. Despite Billy and Debbie rarely talking about the robbery, Michelle and her brothers knew all about it, and they worried about their parents constantly. Debbie said she'd be fine. She could take care of herself, and after all, she'd been closing up the store for 2 decades. Michelle knew better than to argue with her mother, so she told her that she loved her, and then she left. Debbie worked a while longer on her own, then started closing the store. She emptied the cash register and put all the money into a metal lockbox. She turned off the lights and walked outside with the box under her arm. Then she locked the door behind her and climbed into her minivan that was parked out front. And as she drove down the secluded country road outside the store, Debbie felt excited about her dinner plans, and she hoped the Braves were winning so Billy would be in a really good mood when she got home. Early the next morning, Debbie's daughter Michelle sat straight up in bed. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and she could feel her heart pounding. She was terrified, like she'd just had a nightmare. But Michelle knew the fear she was feeling was not because of a dream. Michelle believed that her connection to her mother was something way stronger than a typical bond between mom and daughter. It was almost psychic, like they shared a sixth sense or something. It was like they always knew when the other one was upset or in trouble. And right now, Michelle knew something really bad had happened. She reached over and grabbed her phone off the bedside table and called her mom. When she didn't get an answer, she immediately hung up and called her brother Michael. The second she heard Michael's voice, she said something was wrong with their mom, and since he could get there faster, he needed to get over to her house right away. Michael never doubted the intense connection between his sister and his mom, so he said he was on his way out the door. Michelle hung up the phone, got dressed, and ran out to her car. She sped down the road that cut through most of the small rural towns in Clay County, and then a few minutes later, she turned onto a dirt road that led to her parents' house. As Michelle pulled up in front of the house, she saw her brother pacing back and forth in the yard, and she heard the sound of a police siren in the distance. Michelle got out and ran straight to Michael. He wrapped his arms around her tight and just said, "Sister, they're gone." Early that afternoon, Agent Todd Wheels of the Alabama Bureau of Investigation drove down a 2-lane road lined by acres of trees on one side and a river on the other. This landscape, that would cause most people to feel like they were stranded in the middle of nowhere, felt completely familiar to Agent Wheels. He'd grown up in Clay County, which was not too far from here, so for him, it was like he was coming home. That morning, a call had come into the Bureau from the Clay County Sheriff's Department. County deputies had responded to a 911 call at Debbie and Billy Triplett's house. The second they walked inside, they knew the Sheriff's Department did not have the resources to handle this case, so they had asked the state police for help. Agent Wheels turned onto a dirt road and slowed down as he approached an old white wooden house that sat on a large piece of land that backed up to dense green woods. County police officers had already set up crime scene tape around the perimeter of the house, and a couple of deputies stood out front with a man and a woman in their 20s. Wheels parked his car and looked out at the man and woman, and he felt his heart sink. because he had known both of them since they were little kids. Wheels had grown up in a town not too far from where Michelle, Michael, and their brother Randy lived with their parents, and they had always attended rival schools. So Wheels had seen the entire family at football games, academic competitions, parties, and church functions for most of his life. Wheels took a breath, stepped out of the car, and walked over to Michelle and Michael. He said he hated seeing them under these circumstances, but he needed to look inside the house, and then he would come back out to talk to them. They both nodded like they barely heard what he said, and Wheels ducked under the crime scene tape, put on a pair of gloves, and headed inside. But before he could even take a few steps, he saw Debbie's body lying on the floor. She was surrounded by a huge pool of dried blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls. Wheels had worked homicides in much bigger places than this, cities that had reputations for violence, but this attack on Debbie looked as gruesome as anything he'd ever seen. He crouched down and found Debbie's purse beside her. He noticed bloodstains inside the purse, and it looked like somebody had rifled through it. Wheels thought this could be a sign that this was a robbery gone bad, that somebody had broken in, and then when they heard Debbie come home, they rushed over and killed her as soon as she walked inside. Wheels left Debbie's body and walked down a short hallway into the family room. And there, on the couch, he saw Billy's body, covered in blood as well. This was the first reported double homicide in Clay County in over 40 years. And Agent Wheels could not believe he knew the victims. Wheels approached Billy's body when something on the wall right above caught his attention. When he'd first walked into the room, he thought it was blood spatter. But now, he could see it was red lipstick. And someone had used this lipstick to leave a message for the police. It was a single word: narc. At 4 p.m., several hours after Agent Wheels arrived at the scene, he was back in the family room, staring at the lipstick on the wall for what felt like the 10th time that day. But now, he was with members of a state forensics team that had just arrived. Wheels had gone outside earlier to check on Michelle and Michael, and to ask them if they knew what their parents had been doing the night before. Michael said that he and his wife had met his mom for dinner after she closed the store, and then as far as he knew, she went straight home. And both siblings assumed that their dad had watched the Braves game and then just stayed in for the night. Back in the family room, Wheels and the forensics technicians could still not get over the violence that was inflicted on Billy. This was even more brutal than the attack on Debbie. This kind of rage made Wheels think that the attack must have been carried out by someone who had a close emotional connection to Billy, or by someone who was out for revenge. And the word narc also had strong connections to the drug world. As Wheels stood there, fixated on the wall, he heard people shouting outside, and he snapped out of his trance. He immediately turned around and ran out of the house. In the front yard, Wheels saw a man physically struggling with two deputies and yelling that he and his siblings needed to get inside. Their parents were in there. Wheels recognized this man as Billy's son, Randy. Back when they were teenagers, Wheels and Randy had been on their respective high school's Scholar Bowl teams, and they had developed a friendly rivalry with each other at academic competitions. Wheels darted across the yard, joined the deputies, and in his calm southern accent, told Randy he needed to back off. Randy stopped struggling and looked up at Wheels, and this look came across Randy's face like he didn't understand why this man was standing there. Randy squinted a little and then just said, "Tom?" Agent Wheels said he wished this was not how they were seeing each other for the first time in a while, but he needed Randy to calm down and step back. Randy took a deep breath and apologized to the deputies. He told Wheels he had lashed out because he was mad at himself. He'd missed the messages he'd gotten from Michelle and Michael, and he felt like he'd let his brother and sister down by not getting here earlier. Wheels said he understood. While the two men talked, Wheels heard someone shouting his name from across the yard. He looked over and saw a forensics tech standing by a minivan that was parked near the side of the house. Wheels told Randy to go wait with his siblings, and then he walked over to the van. The front passenger door was open, and the forensics tech said the van had been unlocked. He pointed to the passenger seat, and Wheels saw the keys to the van sitting there. But Wheels also saw something in the passenger side floorboard. It was an open, empty metal box turned over on its side. Wheels called out to the deputies to bring Randy, Michelle, and Michael over to the van, and when the three siblings got there, they didn't look surprised at all. Wheels asked them what the container was, and they told him it was the money box their parents put the cash from the register in every night when they closed the store. And their mom had a terrible habit of just leaving the box in her van when she got home. This clue definitely played into the idea that these murders were connected to a robbery, but maybe it was not a home robbery that got interrupted. Wheels asked the siblings if it was common knowledge around town that their parents put their money from the store in the box every night. Would someone have known Debbie had all that cash and maybe followed her home? The kids looked at each other for a moment, like they were talking without saying anything, and then Michelle said a few months earlier their parents' store had been robbed by some men at closing time, so these men might have known exactly where their parents put the money from the cash register. Wheels got a few more details about that robbery, and then he told the siblings they could go. They should have some time to grieve together in private. Wheels spent the whole day at the house, and it was dark outside when he met the members of the forensics team to get a final report for the day. They believed that Debbie and Billy had been killed the previous night. The team had also pulled blood samples from both bodies and from the rooms where they were found, and they had done a thorough sweep of the minivan. But the van appeared to have been completely wiped down before any investigators had even touched it. However, investigators were confident that with all the blood and all the fingerprints found inside the house, that they would still likely be able to get the print and DNA samples that belonged to the killer. At the time, DNA testing in Alabama was still a relatively slow process. It could take several weeks or even months to get results. Still, Wheels had a lot of faith in DNA testing, so he was willing to be patient. In the meantime, he had two distinct theories about the case. This was either a robbery gone bad, or Billy really had ratted somebody out to the authorities, likely over something having to do with the drug trade. On June 21st, so the day after the bodies had been discovered, Agent Wheels followed Michelle into her house, which was just a few miles away from her parents, and they sat down together in the small front room. Wheels spoke in the calm voice he almost always used on the job. He said he didn't want to imply that anybody was lying, but he had met with county police, and they had no record whatsoever of a robbery that took place at Billy and Debbie's store. So Wheels wanted to know what Michelle and her brothers had been talking about. Michelle sighed. She and her brothers were telling the truth. There had been a robbery. Their parents had just never reported it. Wheels looked totally confused by this. Why on earth would they keep something like that to themselves? Michelle laughed a little and said it was stupid, but her dad had been illegally selling wine and beer, and even a little moonshine out of the back of the store. And he thought if he reported the robbery, the cops would find out about it. In 2001, Clay County, Alabama was what's known as a dry county. This meant it was illegal to sell any alcohol within county limits. When Agent Wheels heard this news about Billy, he laughed just like Michelle had. This was the kind of thing he'd heard about his whole life growing up in Clay County. He knew Billy wasn't running some major bootlegging operation like people had done back during Prohibition. Instead, he was most likely just selling booze to his friends and to some people from town. But at the same time, Wheels could not shake the image of the word narc written on the wall above Billy's body. So he told Michelle he was not worried about Billy selling alcohol to his friends, but he needed to know if Billy was selling anything else illegal. Was Billy mixed up in the local drug trade? This question absolutely floored Michelle. She said there was no way her dad was dealing drugs. Wheels listened, and he didn't say anything, but he agreed with her. And not just because he had known Billy and the family. Wheels was familiar with the growing methamphetamine problem in the area, and he knew from working with colleagues in the state narcotics unit that a lot of the drugs were coming in from out of state, and that Billy did not fit the profile of most local meth dealers and users, who were often younger guys who didn't have steady jobs. So Wheels stood up and told Michelle that was all he needed for now. He said he'd check in with her as often as he could. But before he made it to the door, Michelle told him to wait. Wheels turned and walked back toward her. Michelle said again there was no way her dad was mixed up with drugs, but she did know somebody who was. It was a guy named Leonard Southers, and he happened to be one of Billy and Debbie's closest neighbors. Later that day, so still just one day after the discovery of the bodies, Agent Wheels pulled up to a house over a mile away from Billy and Debbie's. Michelle had been right. Everything was so isolated and spread out around here that this was definitely one of the closest homes to her parents. Wheels stepped out of his car, and he saw the lawn was completely overgrown and there were tools and a bunch of other stuff piled up all around. He took a few steps towards the house, and the screen door flew open. A skinny man in baggy jeans and a t-shirt rushed outside, demanding to know who Wheels was and what he was doing here. Wheels said everything was okay, and then asked the man if he was Leonard. The man nodded and said, "Who's asking?" Wheels introduced himself and said he was with the state police, but Leonard was not in any trouble. In fact, he needed Leonard's help. Wheels took a few more steps towards Leonard, and as he did, he could see track marks on both of his arms, clearly from injecting drugs. And the way Leonard fidgeted and picked at his skin made Wheels think he likely was a meth addict. Looking at Leonard, Wheels mostly just felt pity. This man obviously needed help, but that's not why Wheels was here right now. All of a sudden, Leonard raised both hands into the air to show he was not carrying a weapon, and then he moved towards Wheels. He leaned in really close and then pointed to the trees surrounding his house, and in a hushed voice, he asked if Wheels could see the men up there. Wheels turned and looked up at the trees, and as he did, Leonard started laughing. He said the men were in camouflage, so they were almost invisible, but he knew they were there. And he knew they were men like Wheels, agents that the government sent to watch him all the time. As calm as Wheels was, and as genuinely sympathetic as he tried to be whenever he was working a case, he knew he could change his personality on a dime when he needed to. It was like there was a switch in his head, and in that moment, Wheels flipped the switch. He stood up to his full height, raised his voice, and said Leonard was absolutely right. There were agents hiding in the trees, and if Leonard didn't tell him everything he knew about the deaths of Billy and Debbie Triplett, these agents in the trees would swarm. They would take Leonard away, and he would no longer be a free man. Leonard suddenly looked scared, but he quickly said he did want to help. He had heard Billy and Debbie got killed, and he was sad about it. They were nice people, both of them. Wheels flipped the switch again, and his calm voice came back. He told Leonard if he wanted to help, he needed to tell the truth and admit if he had gone over to Billy and Debbie's house to rob them, maybe for drug money. Leonard shook his head. He would never steal from them or try to hurt them. Wheels spoke with Leonard a while longer in the front yard, and by the time he left, he had a primary suspect. Leonard was a drug addict, and he was extremely paranoid. There was even a chance Leonard had convinced himself that his neighbor Billy was going to turn him in to the police for buying and using drugs, which in Leonard's mind would make Billy a narc. In the days following the murders, Agent Wheels had his team dig into Leonard's background and his history of drug use. Still, Wheels did not want to overlook anything, especially if it was because of a personal bias. He did not believe that Billy or Debbie had any connection to the local drug trade, but he needed to make sure. He asked for help from the state narcotics unit, and they said they would search their records to see if Billy or Debbie ever appeared as suspects or informants, or if any agents knew anything about them. In the meantime, Wheels was still waiting on the results of the DNA tests from the blood samples taken at the crime scene. But he did get an update on the fingerprints found throughout the house. At this point, all of the prints that had been pulled matched Billy, Debbie, and their kids, who had provided prints to the county police. So investigators figured the killer must have worn gloves, which probably meant they would not find any useful prints on the cash box either. This was not surprising, but Wheels still got frustrated. The investigation was in its early days, but he had hoped he might get lucky with the fingerprints and find a clear piece of evidence that pointed to the killer. Wheels always felt a real responsibility when investigating a murder to try to bring the killer to justice as quickly as possible, but he knew this case was something different. He had never worked a homicide where he actually knew the victims and their family, and so every day that he didn't find the killer made him feel like he was letting Michelle, Michael, and Randy down. About a week after the murders, Wheels got word from the narcotics unit that they didn't find anything on Billy or Debbie. It seemed pretty clear they had no connection to illegal drugs. In addition to that, because Billy and Debbie never filed a report about that store robbery, there were no leads on the men who had committed that crime. So, Wheels was basically where he'd been a week earlier, with the drug addict Leonard as his primary suspect. Still, Leonard being an addict and being paranoid about men in the trees did not automatically make him a killer. Wheels had to find something concrete to tie him to the murders. And about 1 week later, Wheels was going back over his notes when he got a phone call. And as soon as he heard the caller's nervous, shaky voice, he knew it was Leonard. And Leonard said that Wheels needed to come to his house right away because he had found blood on his money. Not long after this call, Agent Wheels found himself back in Leonard's front yard, not really knowing what to expect or what Leonard finding blood on his money even meant. Leonard stepped outside, walked over to Wheels, and showed him a stack of $1 and $5 bills he had in a shoebox. Wheels put on his gloves and picked up a few of the bills, and this didn't look like regular cash. The bills were faded, and there were these weird white spots on them, almost like bleach or something. And in that moment, Wheels understood what was going on, and he just stood there dumbfounded for a second, because he realized someone had put all of this money in a washing machine. They had literally tried to launder the money. This did seem like something Leonard might try, not understanding that money laundering was actually a complex illegal financial process that had nothing to do with detergent or bleach. But as ridiculous as all of this seemed to Wheels, a couple of things about these bills did look like major clues. Leonard's money, even after the laundering process, was grouped together in 1s and 5s, like it would be in a cash register. In addition to that, Leonard had not been using some kind of code or metaphor when he said he found blood on his money, because even though these bills were faded, Wheels saw several brownish red spots that he believed were bloodstains. To Wheels, this looked like it had to be the money stolen from the cash box that Debbie brought home from the store, and he assumed the blood on the bills either belonged to Debbie or the killer. Leonard must have sensed what Wheels was thinking because he got really jittery and blurted out that this was not his money. He had gotten it from another drug addict that he knew. Agent Wheels chose not to flip the switch in his demeanor. He stayed totally calm and said to Leonard, "Boy, that sounds like a pretty convenient excuse." But Leonard swore he was telling the truth, and he even told Wheels the name of this other drug addict. Wheels said he'd look into it, but he told Leonard he better not leave town. Wheels confiscated Leonard's cash, bagged it as evidence, and brought it to the county sheriff's station. Over the next few days, Wheels and his team dug into the background of this other drug addict that Leonard had mentioned, and then Wheels brought them in for an interview. At first, when Wheels asked about the night of the murders, he felt like he'd been right about Leonard lying. This interview was not going anywhere. But Wheels shifted his focus, and the interview suddenly took a complete turn. Because when Wheels brought up the money with the blood on it, this drug addict shouted, "That money you got from Leonard? That's my goddamn money!" Wheels just sat there. He couldn't even think of what to say next. He had dealt with a lot of different types of criminals over his career, but he had never heard a suspect just shout out something so potentially damning before. After the interview was over, Wheels let the drug addict go, but he quickly secured a search warrant for the addict's house, and he had the addict's car impounded. And when forensics experts searched the car, they found a faded bloody fingerprint on the driver's side door handle. The sample was sent off to the state lab for testing, and this time the lab expedited the test. So on July 26th, a little over a month after the murders, Agent Wheels got back those test results, along with the results from the initial DNA samples taken from the house. And Wheels knew he had found Billy and Debbie's killer. Based on DNA testing, interviews, and evidence found throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what state police believe happened to Billy and Debbie Triplett on June 19, 2001. That night, the killer quietly walked into Billy and Debbie's kitchen. They could hear the Braves game coming from the TV in the family room. The killer opened a drawer and pulled out a sharp knife. They carefully slid the knife into their back pocket and then walked into the family room. Billy sat up on the couch, and the killer immediately started shouting at him. Billy shouted back and was about to get off the couch, but the killer ran across the room and leapt on top of him. They struggled, but the killer pinned Billy down and without even looking, grabbed something heavy off the coffee table and started wildly slamming it into the side of Billy's head. Blood sprayed on the walls and all over the couch as Billy stopped moving. The killer got up, drew the knife from their pocket, grabbed Billy, and slit his throat.
But the killer didn't stop. They kept digging the knife deeper into Billy's neck until they had almost decapitated him. Finally, the killer stepped back, walked away, and went to the kitchen. They washed the knife off, rinsed their hands and face, and set out some cleaning supplies. Then they picked the knife back up, went to the family room, sat down, and waited while the baseball game kept playing on TV. At 10 p.m., a few hours after the killer had arrived at the house, they heard a car pull up outside. They quickly turned off the TV and ran toward the front of the house, carrying the knife and the blunt object they'd attacked Billy with. They flipped off the light in the entryway and crouched down against the wall not far from the door. The killer heard footsteps just outside, and they clutched the knife tight. The door unlocked, and the killer saw it swing open. And before Debbie could even turn on the light or call to her husband, the killer leapt out of the darkness, grabbed her, slammed the blunt object into her head, and cut her throat too. Debbie's body collapsed just inside the door. The killer flipped on the light, put the knife back in their pocket, and grabbed Debbie's purse. They took out Debbie's car keys, and they saw a tube of lipstick. They walked into the family room, and with the lipstick, they scrawled the word "narc" on the wall over Billy's body. After that, they walked through the house, got the cleaning supplies they'd laid out in the kitchen, and then stepped over Debbie's body and went outside to her minivan. The killer opened the passenger door and saw the metal cash box on the floorboard. They found the key for the box on Debbie's keyring they'd stolen, opened the box, and stuffed the money from it into their pockets, getting blood from their hands all over the cash. The killer quickly wiped down the van with the cleaning supplies and tossed Debbie's keys onto the passenger seat. Then they ran to their car with their hands and pockets filled with cash, cleaning supplies, lipstick, and the murder weapons, and they drove straight home. The following morning, the killer woke up and saw several messages, but they ignored them and waited until later in the afternoon to go back to their parents' house. The bloody cash that Leonard had in his possession was the money from the cash box, but Leonard had told the truth. Another drug addict had given him that money. And this drug addict was Billy's son from his first marriage, Randy. And Randy was the killer. It turned out Randy's drug habit had been going on for years. He struggled to get work, and he almost never had any money. Billy had continually bailed his son out financially, but recently, Billy, and especially Debbie, had just had enough, and Billy had met with his son more than once to tell him they were cutting him off. On the night of the murder, Randy already felt angry and betrayed by Billy and Debbie, and so when he got to the house and saw his dad on the couch, he begged him to give him more money. But Billy said no way, he needed to get his act together and clean up his life. After that, Randy got the knife, argued with his dad again, and then attacked him on the couch with a blunt object, and then slit his throat. Hours later, Randy used the same weapons to kill Debbie. After murdering his dad and stepmom, Randy had the idea to try to make it look like a drug-related murder, so he wrote "narc" on the wall in lipstick. And he figured if that didn't work, police would assume this crime was connected to the earlier robbery at his parents' store. And Randy was right. Investigators focused on both of these theories. But during the investigation, Randy started to panic, and at one point, he literally tried to clean the blood off the cash he had stole in the laundry machine, but when that didn't work, he just gave the bloodstained cash to Leonard, assuming Leonard would hold on to it for him and keep quiet until the investigation died down. But Leonard called Agent Wheels and told him that Randy, who he'd known for a long time and who he did drugs with, was the person who gave him this money. Then, when Randy came in for questioning, he inexplicably shouted out that the blood-stained money was his. Wheels then moved in on Randy, his former Scholar Bowl rival, and had his car impounded. And the DNA sample that was taken from Randy's car door handle would match DNA samples from the crime scene. The blood belonged to Debbie, and Randy had just gotten some of it on his car after killing her. Randy was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But in 2016, he hanged himself in his prison cell. Michelle still thinks about her mother all the time, and she continually reminds people to hug the ones they love, because nobody, no matter how deep a connection they share, knows how much time they have together. At around 8 p.m. on December 16th, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nestor was very stressed out on this ride. All he wanted to do was get home because he was worried that on this ride, he might get pulled over by police. I mean, this was a route he had driven a bunch, and he knew there were loads of state troopers that patrolled the area. And from his perspective, it seemed like they kind of pulled people over all the time. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had a couple of drinks. He didn't feel he had had too much to where he couldn't drive, but he knew if he did get pulled over, he could be in trouble. And then on top of that, in the back of Nestor's mind was the fact that he had a couple of minor run-ins with the law over the past couple of years. And so he kind of had this fear of police already. And also, Nestor was not born in America. And so he was worried that on top of all that, if he got pulled over, he could risk being deported. And so on whole, Nestor just does not want to see any police officer. He just wants to get home and go to bed. And so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself and is trying to follow all the rules of the road, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And his Diet Coke was right in the middle console. And so as he's driving eyes straight ahead, he reaches down and he grabs the Coke, he pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip. But then as he puts the drink back down, again, he's keeping his eyes on the road, he hits something with the drink. And he feels the drink slosh out of his cup and it hits his hand. And instinctively, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder. And then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road. He was too close to swerve out of the way, and so at full speed he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and basically caves in the passenger side windshield and flips up and over the back of his car. And Nestor amazingly was composed enough to not swerve wildly post-impact, because he knew if he did that he could run into oncoming traffic or something. And so he just kept on going straight and gradually slowed down and pulled off the side of the road. And as he did, he looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, or even worse, maybe it hit some other car. But when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Now, even though Nestor was obviously very shaken up at this point, I mean, he just had this horrible car accident with this deer, and he's already on edge about getting pulled over by police. But for the moment, it was just peaceful on the highway. No cops were coming up to him, and he's pulled over to the side. Physically he was okay. It seemed like the deer was okay. It clearly ran off the road or something. And there was damage to his car. I mean, the deer really smashed in the front of his car, and the windshield, especially on the passenger side, was basically caved in. But Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. And so even though Nestor felt kind of bad that he had smashed this deer, he thought, what am I going to do? Go find the deer and make sure it's okay? Like, he can't really do anything. It's nighttime. And so he made the decision that, nobody saw this, and it seems like everything's okay, so I'm just going to drive home and I'll take care of my car tomorrow. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. And so Nestor knew, this is so conspicuous, he's gonna get pulled over if he doesn't stop. And so feeling really annoyed, because he was actually pretty close to home at this point, Nestor pulled off the highway and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. And so at first, all Nestor did was just turn off his car and wait for a couple of minutes in hopes that, that would be enough to cure his car. But after a couple of minutes, the smoke continued to billow out of his car, and then when he tried to turn it back on again, the car simply wouldn't start. And so at this point, Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck. But when he reached for his phone was dead, and he didn't have a phone charger in his car, and so he's like, great, I can't even call a tow truck. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there, and he would ask one of them if they had a charger. So Nestor gets out of his smoking car, he walks into the restaurant, he goes up to the counter, and he asks the person behind the counter, like, hey, my phone's dead, do you have a charger? Do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor, like, no, they don't have a charger. And then they just stood there, still staring at Nestor. And so now Nestor is genuinely just furious. I mean, the whole night has completely derailed here. All he wanted to do was get home, and it's like one horrible thing happens after another. And so Nestor was just like, okay, fine. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And so Nestor gets back into his car, he climbs into the driver's seat, he shuts the door, and as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. And actually, he eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. And so Nestor groggily turned and looked, and it was like the worst case scenario. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle, clearly gesturing for Nestor to roll his window down. And so Nestor was totally compliant. He rolled the window down and he looked at the officer, and before Nestor could even say anything, the officer said, "Get out of the car." So Nestor, he gets out of the car and he's thinking to himself, why is he acting so aggressively towards me? Like, what have I done here? And so Nestor, he gets out of the car, and again, before Nestor can ask any questions, the officer just says to Nestor, "What happened tonight? Like, what's going on here?" And so Nestor, he knows his car is jacked up, and here he is sleeping in the parking lot. And so he turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. He was driving down the road, he hits this deer, it went over the top, he didn't see it, he didn't report it. And as he's telling the officer this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, like, is there a law? Like, if you hit a deer, are you supposed to report it? Is that what's going on? Maybe the deer did die, and it was in the middle of the road, and somebody saw his license plate, and now the cop was here. And so Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer, and how sorry he was, he should have stopped, he should have called the police. But the officer finally just put up his hand, telling Nestor to stop talking, and then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. And when the officer did that, the officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor's like, what is going on here? Like, this whole night has been such a disaster. Like, what did I do? And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car that would elicit such a big response from him. And when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, where the cop's light was now shining, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he had only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk and should never have been behind the wheel. And when he was driving on the highway, anxiously trying to get home, well, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat, minus one leg, which had been severed on impact. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. He thinks there's a deer back there, but there was never a deer. There's just a dead guy next to him. And Nestor just drove 40 more miles with Terry's dead body next to him. And then when Nestor's car began to smoke and make noises, he pulled off the highway to that fast food restaurant parking lot. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor and could basically not even speak when Nestor was trying to talk to them was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood, Terry's blood. Now, it's not entirely clear why that employee did not immediately call police, but, after Nestor left the restaurant, went back to his car, and fell asleep, during the time Nestor was sleeping, someone inside the restaurant did call the police, and that's why they showed up and knocked on Nestor's glass. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated. On the afternoon of December 15th, 1997, a brand new mother named Luz Cuevas sat on her couch in her little apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cradling her beautiful 10-day-old baby girl who she had named Delamar Vera. And in the room with Luz and her daughter were some members of Luz's extended family who had come over to meet the baby. And so for about an hour, the family all took turns, holding the baby and complimenting how cute her little dimples looked. And then eventually the baby started to get fussy, at which point Luz said she was going to take her upstairs and put her to bed. And so Luz brought Delamar upstairs to her nursery, and she put the baby down in her crib, and she stayed with her for a bit until Delamar finally had kind of dozed off to sleep. And so after being sure that her daughter wasn't going to stir, Luz got up and she began making her way towards the door, and right before she left, she made sure to plug in the space heater for her daughter's room to make sure it would stay warm enough while her daughter slept. And then after that, she left the room, shut the nursery door, and went back downstairs to rejoin her family. Luz's family didn't stick around much longer after Luz came downstairs, and after they were all gone, Luz realized she was totally exhausted and her daughter was still fast asleep upstairs, and so Luz decided she would also lie down and try to take a nap herself. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard this loud thud sound coming from the second floor. And it sounded like something really heavy had smashed into the ground. And she's thinking, her daughter's up there. Could that be her daughter somehow falling out of the crib or something? And so Luce jumped up, sprinted upstairs, and as she looked down the hall, she could clearly see there was black smoke billowing out of her daughter's nursery. And so Luce charges down the hall, she opens up the door, and she looks into her daughter's room, and it's completely engulfed in flames. I mean, everything is on fire, but it's her baby girl in there, and so without any hesitation, Luce charges into the inferno. But when she gets up to the crib, the crib is so completely on fire that when she looks in, she can't even see her daughter. And so in a craze, she begins looking around the room, thinking maybe my daughter did fall out of the crib, and she's somewhere else in the room, but everything is on fire. She can't see anything. And so as Luce is literally catching on fire and breathing in all the smoke, she's screaming for her daughter. And then a couple of minutes later, firefighters burst into the door and they literally drag Luce out of the nursery. She hasn't found her daughter. She's screaming, where's my baby? But the firefighters, they bring her outside. And just a couple of minutes later, they were able to extinguish this blaze. And after they came out of the house again, they found Luce, who had all these terrible burns in her body, and she's totally messed up from this fire. And they tell her that unfortunately, her daughter was dead. After Delamar's death, Luce's life completely fell apart. I mean, the grief was so immense. It was like she could no longer function in society. I mean, she actually retracted from the world, stopped interacting with people, didn't see her family. She wound up getting a divorce from her husband just over the grief and the sadness of losing this child. I mean, it was like her life basically ended when her daughter's life ended. But on top of that, Luce also felt this incredible sense of guilt because after the fire, the investigators told her that the cause of the fire, although not conclusive, was very likely from that space heater she had plugged in right before she had left the room. And so, of course, Luce is feeling this incredible burden for having potentially killed her daughter, but also she just began to obsess over the details because, again, it wasn't conclusive that it was the space heater. That was their best guess as to what caused the fire. And so Luce began to wonder, was it something else? Was it preventable? What was it? Basically, Luce became completely obsessed with what happened to her daughter. It was like the only thing she ever thought of for years. Fast forward to January 24th, 2004, so 6 years after the fire. And on this day, Luce was invited to a family party. There was a get-together, and, Luce basically never went to any family function or really left her house much at all. But for some reason, on this day, she decided to go out. And so she goes to this party, and when she gets there, remember, Luce has basically been a recluse for the past 6 years. And so she's not going to immediately start socializing. And so instead, she just goes in the house and kind of finds a spot in the back, kind of away from everybody else who's chatting, and just stands there, kind of people watching. And as she's doing that, something catches her attention off to the side. And when she turns to look at it and sees what it is, she immediately just freezes. 3 days later, Luce walked into the office of a local state legislator, and after saying hello, she sat down, reached into her purse, and pulled out a little plastic bag that contained a folded up napkin. And she slid it across the table to the legislator. And so he picked up the bag and stared at it inquisitively as Luce dove into this wild explanation about what was in this bag and why she was here. And at the end of this totally off-the-wall, insane-sounding story, the legislator was left just kind of staring at Luce and looking back at the bag in total shock. And then finally, after a couple of moments of silence, the legislator just said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." It would turn out the fire was not caused by the space heater that Luce had plugged in right before she left her daughter's room. Instead, police believe after Luce came downstairs and tried to take a nap, somebody broke into her apartment, went into the nursery, and set the fire on purpose, but not before abducting the baby. And that person was one of Luce's own family members who had been at her apartment that day celebrating the birth of Delamar Vera. It was Luce's husband's cousin, Carolyn Correa. And in fact, on this same day, before the fire and before the abduction, Carolyn made a point to announce to the whole family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. It was just going to be her cover story for why she suddenly had this brand new baby. 6 years later, when Luce was at that family party, well, the thing that caught her attention on the other side of the room was her daughter. She literally saw her daughter, and even though she hadn't seen her in 6 years, she instantly knew it was her because of her distinctive dimples. Now, Luce knew she couldn't just suddenly yell out, like, "That's my daughter!" So instead, she came up with this plan. She walked up to the girl and very discreetly said, "Hey, honey, I think you got some gum in your hair." And so as she pretended to pull gum out of the child's hair, she carefully plucked a few strands and put them inside of a napkin and put it inside of her pocket. And then 3 days later, she brought that hair inside of that plastic baggie and she gave it to the legislator and basically said, "Here's what I think happened. I think she stole my kid. Can you test it for DNA to prove that girl is my daughter?" And the legislator was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And lo and behold, that hair would prove that girl at the party was her daughter. She did not die in that fire. Carolyn Correa was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison for abduction. She originally had an arson charge against her as well, but investigators could not actually prove how the fire started, and so they ultimately dropped those charges. Officials also launched an inquiry into how the fire department had handled the original investigation, because Luce had tried to convince fire officials that, maybe her daughter had not died in the blaze, maybe she was just missing, because when Luce went into the nursery, she claimed she couldn't even find her daughter, but investigators had told her that the fire had burned so hot that basically her daughter had been totally incinerated, and that's why she couldn't find her. In the end, though, because of her refusal to ever give up, Luce was ultimately reunited with her daughter, Delamar. On January 30th, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. And so after walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out, and then eventually he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. And so without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave. And Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels, but today his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old, and he knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored. And so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave and map it all out and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot wide cathedral-like space inside of this hill with ceilings high enough you could stand, but it's totally dark in there. And despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. And so, as Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing, even for a very experienced caver. And so Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway, and he reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. And this tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. And Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going, because again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving. He loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so Floyd got to this hole, he put his oil lamp down on the ground, he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet, and then once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. And so he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel. And after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction. And so he immediately began going head first into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go head first into a tunnel and you get stuck, what are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going head first into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way head first and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. It's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity. But as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath. By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was, where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees on, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in, because those were the big tourist attractions. Not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd because it allowed him to advertise that this cave where tourists could go explore was full of all this rich history. And so Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him, with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of Sand Cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground, the walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. Now, to most people, that would be terrifying, but Floyd, again, was so experienced, he was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill, and then he rolled onto his back. So his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling, and he's on his back. And so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Have you ever thought to yourself, wow,
MrBallen is so cool. I just wish there was some way he and I could come together and lay the smackdown on the ultra-successful, highly popular social platform Discord. Well, if that's you, today's your lucky day. Because our partners over at Discord just told me that if I wanted to host a live storytelling event on Discord, they would uncap the number of people who could watch it live. For reference, Discord has never done this before, because if you allow an unlimited number of people to join a live stream at one time, it could easily destroy the server temporarily. But you know what they told me when I asked them how they felt about having that be a potential outcome? They said, "Don't worry, John. That would only happen if you had at least 10,000 people on the show at once. And that's not going to happen." Those fools. In 2 weeks, on May 19th at 7 p.m. Central, I'm going to host that live storytelling event on Discord. It's totally free, and I need all of you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious to do me a favor and log in right at the start, just so we can surpass the 10,000 viewer mark and destroy Discord's server temporarily. And then after they fix it, which will be quick, I will spend the rest of the live stream telling you stories. Joining our official MrBallen Discord server, where I'll do this live stream, is quick and easy. All you gotta do is click the link in the description, choose your adventure, agree to follow our community rules, and then on May 19th at 7 p.m. Central, click on the live storytelling event. Me and old Sing-Along will see you there. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm, he knew where he was in the cave, he just needed to get to that little pocket, he'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up, eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole, he'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black, he can't see anything, and so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him. But then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the low ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. And in fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave. And so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of like hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle. And his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then I'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock, but his foot wouldn't budge. And so Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out. He'd just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low, and he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing, and they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here, they would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness, trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours, and then finally, he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness, I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in. And Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, he shines the light on Floyd, and the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, had set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now, but Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful, he's very relieved, he says goodbye to Homer, and Homer turns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself, and so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd, he's laying there kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him, and then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time. But luckily, Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked, and so Floyd was in good spirits, and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you gotta remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home and sleep and eat and drink and kind of recover. But he told Floyd, don't worry, tomorrow more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get Floyd out of there. But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside of this tunnel with the rock pinning his leg, and despite Homer and several other men getting down there and very diligently chipping away at this tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. And so over the course of those 50 hours, Floyd began going in and out of consciousness, and he began not being able to differentiate between what was real and what was not. At one point, he would say that he believed the cave had kind of opened up and these angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come in to save him. And as they were lifting him out of the cave, he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly his hallucination cleared and he realized he was trapped in the darkness all alone, still in this cave. And it was like it destroyed his morale. And so Floyd is really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers are realizing they need to do something, and they need to do something now. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse for Floyd. As he was laying there in the tunnel, this was sometime in the middle of the night, and so no rescuers were actively down there trying to chisel their way down to him. He was laying there, and he was listening to the sound of the running water somewhere outside the cave, and that sound was kind of amplified down to him. And then all of a sudden, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere up above, and then when those rocks stopped and it went silent again, he could not hear the sound of the running water. It was very muffled. And that was when he realized that there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up in the cave, which meant potentially there could be a significant block just to get down to him. Forget about widening this tunnel. I mean, he could be actually entombed inside of Sand Cave. And so Floyd did the only thing he could do, which was to pray. It would turn out that cave-in had indeed blocked the way for rescuers to get down to Floyd. And because of how extensive this cave-in was, the rescuers actually decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. I mean, this is an even bigger undertaking than just chiseling the side of the tunnel that Floyd was in, which was their original plan and had taken several days. And so now they have to build this brand new tunnel to Floyd. And so finally, on February 16th, 1925, so a staggering 17 days from the time Floyd got first stuck in this cave, the rescue team finally punched through and reached Floyd. And as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, and then he paused, he turned up, and he just said, "Dead." It would turn out shortly after that cave-in, which sealed Floyd in completely inside of Sand Cave, at some point over the next couple of days, those rocks began to break free and tumble down the cave and began striking Floyd until finally one or several of those rocks hit him in the head or chest and killed him. So just imagine you are trapped. You've been there for several days. You're in total darkness. You're entombed inside of this cave, and periodically rocks just come tumbling down and smash into you. Who knows how long it took to kill him, but that has to be one of the most agonizing ways to go ever. Shortly before that cave-in first happened, a photographer took a picture of Floyd, who at the time believed he was going to get out, and all the rescuers believed they were going to get him out. But shortly after this photo was taken, the cave-in would happen, and at that point, Floyd didn't know it, but he was doomed. Here is that photo. Floyd's body was eventually removed from Sand Cave. However, instead of being buried, because of the interest around this cave rescue that ultimately failed, there was a decision made to actually put Floyd's body on display inside of another cave. Basically, Floyd's body became a tourist attraction. And it would remain a tourist attraction for decades until finally he was removed from that cave and given a proper burial.
What's going on, guys? MrBallen here, former Navy SEAL turned internet storyteller with a focus on the strange, dark, and mysterious. And speaking of mysterious, today I have a mystery for you, and it's one of the more recent mysteries. It happened in 2014 and spanned a couple of years following that. It is a story that plays out like a psychological thriller, and in fact, Netflix recently purchased the rights to make a movie or show about this case from the family that were the victims of this case. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have this all-American family that purchases their dream home. They're getting ready to move in, and they start receiving these awful, wrathful, threatening letters from some anonymous person or group. The letters get progressively worse and indicate that whoever is watching them very closely at all hours and is able to see things that are not easy to spot just from walking by. This is someone who is really intensely focused on the family. I think that the best way to watch this video and learn about this case, to really appreciate what this family went through, is to put yourself in the position of being the Broaddus family. That's the family that purchases the house. Imagine you're in their position. Would you have stayed or would you have left? And I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. So let's dive in. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus purchased their dream home. It is a $1.3 million 6-bedroom house in Westfield, New Jersey, which is a very affluent northern New Jersey town. So the house they purchased was on Boulevard, that's the street name, and Boulevard within Westfield is at the time was like the street. If you lived on Boulevard, you had made it. I would say that times have changed because now Boulevard is remembered as the place where this case happened, so I would say it's probably not the best place to live anymore, but at the time it was like Derek and Maria were living their dreams and they knew it. 3 days after the sale of the house, they hadn't moved in yet. Derek had gone to the house to do some painting of the walls and some simple house renovations. I think he was just so excited about this house. He He just wanted to go over and just kind of be in the space. So his wife and his kids are back at their old house that they had sold but hadn't moved out of yet. And so he's at the new house and he's doing these simple renovations, and he's like, you know what, I'm gonna check the mail. Because even though they'd only owned the house for 3 days, he was like, you know what the heck, see what it feels like to go collect the mail, because this is gonna be my new home. And so he goes out and he opens the mailbox, and inside is this little tiny card-shaped envelope addressed to the new owners.
Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I'll find out.
The letter goes on to identify what kind of car they were driving. It was a Honda minivan. It went on to say how many contractors were in and around the house over the past couple of days that were doing some renovations in the house. It even said that, I believe I've counted that you have 3 children. Someday I will learn their names and I will call to them and I will take them from you. It's like a reconnaissance of his family had already begun as soon as they moved in. And so Derek is reading through this letter and he's realizing that whoever is sending this is not a friendly neighbor at this point. This is someone who is out to harm them in some way. So he takes the letter, he runs back into the house, shuts all the windows, locks all the doors, leaves the house and goes right back to his wife and his kids that are at their old home. And they promptly call the police. Police show up, they read the letter, and they're like, what is this? Do you have enemies? Who wrote you this? Because even the language inside the letter was it was not quite Old English, but close. It was like this bizarre writing, and it was just very stalkerish and awful, and the police just don't really know what to make of it. And Derek and Maria are obviously very upset. They haven't even moved into the house yet, but this is a big cause for concern. So the letter did not have a return address, but at the end of the letter, it just said,
who am I? I could be someone that's walking by your house every day. I could be someone driving by your house every day. I could be one of your neighbors. I could be anybody that you see at any given day, and you'll never know.
And then it just says, signed, The Watcher. After the police leave that night and promise to launch their own investigation, Derek and Maria, they're totally on edge. And so they write an email, even though it's super late, to the Woods family. They're the family that sold the house to Derek and Maria. And they say, hey, we just got the strange threatening letter. Have you received anything like this? Because the Watcher claims to have been watching you for the entire time you were there. And the Woods family writes back and they say, 3 days, I think it was 3 days before we actually left the house, we did receive a letter. It wasn't threatening. It was just thanking us for our time in the house and treating it with respect, and that it would be taken care of going forward, and that this person would look after the house for us. And it was signed The Watcher. But to be honest, we didn't think much of it. We crumpled it up and threw it away. So the Broadduses decide that they are not going to rush to actually move into the new house. They had thought about doing it, but they decide with this letter that maybe it's best to hold off a little bit. And so Derek and Maria would do day trips with the kids. They'd go do a day trip, do some renovations, make sure that the contractors that were there were doing a good job getting the house in order, and then they would come back to the house that they were still living in. About 2 weeks after that letter was found, Maria is there with the kids, and she gets to the new house and she sees there's a letter from the Watcher, the same envelope, same writing on the outside. And so she immediately calls the police even before she reads it. She opens it up and it says,
welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what's in the walls yet? In time, they will.
The Watcher goes on to identify each of their kids by nickname and by birth order. which implies that whoever this was close enough to Maria or to Derek when they were speaking directly to their kids using their nicknames that they overheard. Because it's one thing to know the children's full names, because it's possible that you could have looked it up online or something, but to know their nicknames, that implies a level of proximity that even though they knew the watcher was probably in the neighborhood, almost definitely, this meant they were practically on top of one another. And it gets creepier. The watcher also in this letter asks, about one of the children and says, is she going to be an artist? I saw her using her easel yesterday. Well, the easel that this girl had been using is in a back room of the house that is mostly obscured by trees and shrubbery. There's really only one vantage point where you could see this child, and it would mean you're right on the property, like pretty much in plain view of anybody there. And with Maria and Derek and basically everyone on high alert looking for this person, it seems odd that they could be able to see this girl working at her easel in this kind of hidden back room and not be spotted. And then, of course, to kind of seal the deal, making this letter just totally terrifying, they go on to say,
do your kids go in the basement? I'd be afraid if I were them. It's far away from the rest of the house, and if you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. Then I can plan better.
So at this point, Derek and Maria are in full crisis mode, because it's one thing to be watched, which is bad. It's another when the person watching you is now overtly threatening your family, your kids. It's a bad situation. So Derek and Maria at this point, they don't know if they're even ever going to move into this new house. It felt unsafe. And so for a few weeks, they're kind of teetering on whether it's worth moving in or not, and so that they aren't there. They're not going to the new house at all. And a third letter arrives basically saying, where are you? The house misses you, obviously from the watcher. At one point between the first letter and third letter, Derek was speaking with John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down from their new property on Boulevard. And John was saying that Derek ought to look into the Langfords. It was a family that lived right next to their new house, kind of a little bit of a strange family. It was a 90-something-year-old mother and her adult children who lived with her, who were all in their 60s. And one of the children, Michael, he was just known in the area about being a little bit odd. Like he would just kind of creep out other people. It wasn't uncommon to have him like walk across people's property, like little things like that, like looking in windows, just giving the vibe that he was a little bit strange and people didn't really like being around him. So Derek brings it up to the police that, hey, you should look into Michael Langford. He lives right near us. Neighbors are saying he's a little bit off. The police were like, actually, he was the first person we talked to. We brought him in, we questioned him, he denied it, we have no evidence tying him to it, and we just don't think it's him. And then later on in the investigation, they would actually do a DNA sample from one of the letters, and they would find out that it was a woman's DNA. And so that effectively ruled out Michael Langford, but the Langfords had a daughter. And so they decided maybe it could be her. And so they actually got a water bottle from her that they found, and they tested that, and it wasn't a match. So the Langfords were ruled out. Derek is growing increasingly more paranoid and angry. He went from being, scared of what was potentially going to happen to feeling like, how dare you threaten my family, my kids? And he started telling the police, like, if you don't find who's doing this, I'm going to figure out who it is. And then you're not going to be dealing with, a stalking case. You're going to be dealing with a different kind of case, if you catch my drift. And so the police were like, don't do anything crazy. We're working as hard as we can. It's just, there's not much to go on here. Derek wasn't okay with that. He set up this elaborate camera system in and around his house, the new house. He started staying at the new house, turning off all the lights and crouching behind windows and staring at the mailbox in hopes of being able to confront anybody who went near it. He ended up hiring 2 former FBI agents to launch his own private investigation. He hired a handwriting expert to analyze the letters themselves to see if they could pick up details about who this was and potentially profile them. And this person, all they could conclude was it was someone who was really, really mad. But all those things really didn't lead to any results. It was just Derek had become obsessed, and he was willing to basically do anything to find out who the heck is writing these letters. So at this point, the Broadduses had already sold their old house. They were still living in it because they hadn't moved into the new house, the house being watched.
But at some point, the new owners of the house they sold were ready to move in. And so the Broadduses had to move in with Maria's family, but were still paying the mortgage on 657 Boulevard. At this point, the community started kind of spreading rumors about the Broaddus family. People believed that the reason they weren't moving into this beautiful new home was, they were getting a divorce, or they had some legal problems. The letters and what was going on with these letters, that was not widely known. There was speculation about it, but no one really knew for sure. So Derek and Maria kind of gradually became pariahs, and they ultimately decided that they're just going to sell this house, this new house they purchased, because they need the money. They've tied up a lot of money in it, and they feel like, we'll sell the house and we'll move on. But by the time they listed it, enough rumors were circulating about the weirdness around that house and why no one was moving into it, and the weirdness with Derek and Maria, that nobody wanted to buy. And so they initially list this property above what they paid, because they had put $100,000 into the house in renovations. They just kept doing renovations, and that was their way of justifying not moving in. They were like, we'll keep fixing it up, it'll be better once we move in. But so they put $100K in, and no one bid. They lower the price, no one bid. They continued to lower the price to where it was like a full-blown deficit. Still, no one made an offer, so it sat vacant. At this point, Maria and Derek turned their frustration towards the previous owners, because as I mentioned earlier, they had received a letter from the Watcher. Granted, it was, at the very end of their stay in this house, but it was before they gave over the keys to the Broaddus family. And Derek and Maria felt like the fact that they got an anonymous letter that was literally signed The Watcher, that name alone was kind of ominous enough that they felt like the Woods family should have disclosed that to the Broaddus family before they moved in. And so they filed a legal complaint against the Woods family, basically saying that you held information that potentially would have kept us from moving in and not having this problem. Well, Derek and Maria were assured by their legal team that at most, a small legal newswire might pick up this lawsuit, and that would be it. But the story, it got picked up by a number of outlets. The fact that they were filing a complaint against the previous owners over basically a stalker. And all of a sudden, they were all over the news. The Broaddus family had over 300 media requests. There were TV stations and news stations camped out on the front lawn. Everybody wanted to know what's going on with this bizarre, Watcher. It became this huge thing. And so for Derek and Maria and their family, they had to vacate Westfield because it was basically not only unsafe because they were being watched by this phantom menace, but now they couldn't escape the media pressure and all the speculation from their nosy neighbors. It was just a total train wreck. Finally, the Broaddus family got some good news, literally years after this first letter is sent and they tied up all their money in this new house. A family agrees to rent the house. Now, this is going to be at a loss for the Broaddus family. The rent money will not even cover the mortgage, but to them who've just been sitting on this worthless property that's just been eating away at their finances, this was a huge win. The Broaddus family, they put into the contract with this new family that, hey, you know what's going on here with the Watcher. If you get another letter, you're able to renege on this contract. And so the new family moves in, and 2 weeks into being there, what do you think happens? Another letter shows up.
You wonder who the Watcher is. Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and they saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher.
The renter was also mentioned in this letter and was definitely spooked. But they decide that they're still willing to stick around because they knew going in this could happen. They just asked that the Broaddus family install even more cameras. And so they did that, they installed more cameras, and they decided to stay. Derek and Maria are obviously disheartened, but at the same time, now they have more evidence against the Watcher. And so they take this new letter, they bring it to the police, and unfortunately, much like the other few letters they'd received,
There was nothing much to go on, except that you have this person claiming to watch them, but no hard evidence to tie it to anybody. So once again, they got nowhere. After renting this house out for a while to this family at a deficit, the Broaddus family in 2019 finally decide to just sell the house at a $400,000 deficit. It was just a huge nightmare, and at this point they were willing to pay $400,000 to get rid of it. Before they sold it, they received one more letter, and this is what it said.
You are despised by the house, and the Watcher won.
Despite the investigation by police and the unofficial investigation by Derek's private investigators, we are not anywhere closer to figuring out who the Watcher is, or what's hidden in the walls. It's all still a huge mystery. Many people have speculated that the Broaddus family, that Derek specifically, was probably the person who wrote the letters, because in fact, he would later admit that he wrote a number of anonymous letters to people in the community that had been bad-mouthing he and his family. But he said it was purely out of frustration. I wanted to scare them and make them, feel what it was like to have the Watcher watching them. But he said, like this whole situation has really devastated them financially and emotionally, and, kind of ruined their ability to stay in the town that they loved so much. So it just, the angle that he stood to benefit from this, it's not a very good theory in my opinion. In addition, recently Netflix bought the rights to their story. But if Derek and his family had said, what we're going to do is we're going to set up this elaborate mystery around ourselves for years in order to secure movie rights, you'd be putting your kids through something so traumatic. And so the idea of like having your kids have to live with the fear of being attacked and getting bullied at school because, everybody talks in these communities, that seems far-fetched too. It remains to be seen who the Watcher is, but to this day, it remains a mystery. So if you haven't already, please click like and subscribe. I am going to be trying to do...
My screen glows brighter than the morning light. Another notification steals another night. Everybody's running, chasing something new. I stop for a second, asking what is true. A calendar packed from the start to the end. Always connected, but I miss my friends. 1,000 voices filling up the air. Still feels like silence everywhere. Just one moment, put the world aside. Just one moment. Rain falls, static in the air. A broken city whispers nowhere. The city sleeps beneath the fading light. Broken streets swallowed by the night. We stand in silence, no map, no name. Just hearts still burning through.
Two or more stories a week. I'm really making a push to make YouTube my primary, so I hope you'll tag along. If you want to talk to me separately, you can DM me on Instagram. That's JohnBallen416. Also, go follow me on TikTok. My